My parents always said they raised me to be independent. They said it with pride at dinner parties, to neighbors, to distant relatives who visited twice a decade and left impressed by how well-adjusted I was. We never spoiled her, my father would declare, as if withholding affection had been some noble strategy. She earned everything on her own, my mother would add with a smug smile, neglecting to mention the 100 little ways they'd made sure I stayed in my place, always a few steps behind them. But here's the truth. I wasn't raised to be strong. I was raised to be obedient, to perform, to stay useful but never powerful, and definitely never equal. I learned early that love in our household came with terms and conditions. A clean report card earned a hug, a chore done without being asked earned a nod. But mistakes, tears, weakness, those were punished not always with yelling, but with silence, with withdrawal, with disapproval. And in that house, disapproval felt like death, so I adapted. I got good at being what they needed. Quiet, capable, impressive on paper. I graduated early, skipped parties, took care of my younger cousin when my aunt got sick, won awards, got into law school. My parents attended the graduation ceremony like it was a red carpet event, then told everyone at the reception how they had guided me every step of the way. I smiled, said nothing, let them bask. Because I had learned, if you stay useful, they'll let you stay. What they never expected, what they couldn't anticipate was that I'd actually become the thing they pretended to want, self-sufficient, capable, and afraid. I got a job at a rising tech firm as in-house counsel. I built a savings account. I started looking into buying my own place, and somewhere in the middle of that ascent, I stopped asking for their approval. That's when things began to change. It started subtly. My mother's backhanded compliments turned sharper. You've always been good at paperwork, sweetheart, maybe too good. My father started calling less, but asking more questions when he did. Whose name is on the condo again? What's the access code to your home office just in case? Asterisk, I brushed it off. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but I should have. Because 6 months after my promotion, I received a letter from their attorney, a petition for guardianship, filed by my parents, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. They wanted everything: control over my finances, my property, my medical decisions. They claimed I was displaying signs of erratic behavior, withdrawing from reality, obsessively paranoid about privacy. They said I was unstable. They wanted the court to hand them the keys to my entire life. And I knew exactly why. Because they thought I had no one to defend me. Because they thought, after a lifetime of conditioning, I would fall apart under pressure. Because they thought they had finally found a legal way to make sure I never stood taller than them again. They were wrong, and I had the paper to prove it. I didn't cry when I read the court documents. I wish I could say I did, that I broke down, collapsed into some romantic heap of grief and betrayal. But there were no tears, just a numb, ice-cold clarity that settled into my bones as I flipped through page after page of carefully crafted lies written by the people who once taught me how to hold a spoon. They said I had become increasingly volatile, that I'd displayed erratic emotional outbursts, suspicious hoarding of financial records, and a concerning obsession with digital security. They claimed I'd isolated myself from healthy familial connection, and was delusional in believing I could manage a high-stakes legal career on my own. Every sentence dripped with condescension, the language of concern wrapped around a dagger of control. What made it worse was how well they had done it. These weren't sloppy accusations, they had done their homework. My mother had gathered statements from old family friends, taken entirely out of context. She never answers the phone became evidence of isolation. She sounded short on the phone once became a red flag for instability. My father submitted a signed affidavit from a former high school teacher of mine, of all people, who recalled that I'd been high-strung and intense as a teenager. That was all they needed, just enough to paint me unstable in grayscale, and let the court fill in the rest. But what made my stomach twist wasn't the lies, it was the precision. They had planned this. This wasn't a reaction to something I'd done. This wasn't a concerned intervention. This was a long game, a legal ambush crafted by two people who knew exactly where my vulnerabilities were because they had built them. They'd watched me climb, inch by inch, and decided that if they couldn't control me anymore, they would destroy me from the inside out. And why? Because they knew I was about to become untouchable. That year, my firm was finalizing its merger with the European defense contractor. It would have made me the youngest corporate counsel in the company's history to sit on the board, elevating me to a level of access and influence they could never reach. And they knew it. I hadn't told them directly, had learned better by then, but they could smell it. My distance, my focus, my momentum. They couldn't stop me. So they tried to own me. The guardianship filing wasn't just an attack, it was a message. You are not free, not from us. But what they hadn't counted on was what I had been building in the shadows. They thought they still knew me, thought I was still the girl who needed their praise like oxygen, who couldn't make a decision without checking whether they approved. But they had underestimated what years of quiet survival had taught me. I had protected myself in ways they never saw coming. For every account, I had encryption. For every document, a duplicate. I had firewalls, backups, contracts reviewed twice over by colleagues I trusted more than family. I had learned to live in a world where safety wasn't a default, it was earned, built, defended. And most importantly, I had one piece of paper, one document, hidden away, that I never thought I'd need, but had prepared just in case. Because somewhere deep down, I had always known. They didn't love me unconditionally. They loved me as long as I stayed small. And now that I wasn't small anymore, they wanted the pieces of me they thought they could monetize. My assets, my name, my leverage. They wanted to put me in a gilded cage and call it protection, strip me of my autonomy and label it parental concern. They thought the law would be on their side. They were wrong. Because while they were preparing a courtroom ambush, I was preparing a defense that would do more than expose them. It would destroy them. The first court hearing was held in Department 17 of the county courthouse, a long, cold room with pale yellow walls and benches that creaked beneath the weight of tension. I sat at the respondent's table in a navy blazer, spine straight, eyes forward. I didn't fidget. I didn't blink too often. Every movement, every breath was calculated. Because when your own parents accuse you of mental incompetence, you don't get the luxury of emotion. You don't get to look like a daughter. You have to look like a witness. Across from me, my parents were dressed for the cameras they wished were there. My mother wore pearls, a conservative charcoal dress, hair perfectly coiffed like a mourning widow in a drama she had written in her own head. My father sat with his hands folded on the table, shoulders squared, exuding that same cold, patriarchal authority that used to make teachers and coaches call him sir even when he didn't ask for it. They looked like the very image of concern, like aging saints doing their painful, dignified duty. The court clerk read out the nature of the filing: petition for full guardianship, emergency powers requested, citing mental and emotional instability, financial irresponsibility, paranoia, and behavior consistent with early-stage dissociative disorder. That last part almost made me laugh. I hadn't seen a therapist since undergrad. But they had attached a letter from a wellness consultant, a woman with an expired license, and a YouTube channel who had never met me. She had reviewed emails and behavioral summaries written by my mother, and based solely on that, had drafted a letter suggesting I was showing hallmarks of disassociation. My attorney, Olivia Navarro, leaned in and whispered, "They're playing every card." That's a good sign. A good sign. Because desperation makes people careless. The judge, a woman in her 60s with the sharp, tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many families cannibalize themselves, asked if we had a rebuttal. Olivia stood, handed her a binder. Inside was my employment record, notarized letters from my firm's managing partners, performance reviews, bank statements, property records, and most importantly, a private psychological evaluation conducted a month prior by a court-certified forensic psychiatrist. Clean bill of health, sound decision-making, no risk of harm to self or others. Nothing they had claimed was grounded in reality, not legally, not clinically. The judge flipped through it with thin, practiced fingers. Then she turned to my parents. "Why is your daughter's performance review from last quarter marked exceeds expectations if she's incapable of making sound judgments?" My mother started to answer, but stumbled. My father cleared his throat. "We believe she's hiding her deterioration. People with serious disorders can appear highly functional. Some even hold down impressive jobs for years while masking their symptoms." "And the alleged evidence of instability?" the judge asked. She keeps her finances private. Won't tell us what she's investing in. She encrypts her files," my mother said, voice rising as she scrambled for the script she'd rehearsed. "She changes her passwords frequently, doesn't let anyone into her home office, doesn't answer her phone for days. How is that normal?" The judge raised one brow. "That sounds like a cybersecurity-aware attorney, not a delusional recluse." I had to suppress the smile twitching at the corner of my mouth. They were unraveling, not because they weren't prepared, but because they had never imagined someone would question them. For so long, their authority had gone unchecked. They were the kind of people who corrected waiters, demanded corporate discounts, and told me with a straight face that my boss only promoted me because of how I looked in a blazer. They believed they could manufacture a reality, and for a while, they had. But now, sitting in a courtroom with the full weight of due process staring them in the face, their version of the truth was beginning to buckle. Still, the judge didn't dismiss the petition that day. Instead, she called for a full evidentiary hearing to determine intent. She wanted to review all relevant documents, including any supplemental filings. She gave both sides 2 weeks to produce anything further for the record. When she banged the gavel and stood, I watched my parents rise to still poised, still trying to look like martyrs instead of manipulators. But their eyes were different now, less sure, less polished, because they had come expecting an easy victory, and what they got was resistance. Outside the courtroom, my mother approached. "You're making a scene," she said softly. "You don't have to drag this out. If you just cooperate, we can make this painless." I turned toward her, full height, full voice. "No, Mom, you can make this painless. All you have to do is walk away." Her expression didn't change, but her knuckles whitened on the strap of her handbag. My father said nothing, just walked past me like I was a stranger. And maybe, in that moment, I was, because the version of me they had spent 30 years sculpting obedient, agreeable, malleable no longer existed. What stood before them now was a woman prepared for war, and I hadn't even played my best card yet. The 2 weeks between hearings were the quietest war I had ever fought. There were no explosions, no screaming matches, no impassioned speeches, just silence, strategy, and a rising tide of fury that I kept locked behind every click of my keyboard. I lived inside spreadsheets and case law, inside timelines and correspondence chains. Every morning I met with Olivia, my attorney, and every evening I sat by my living room window in the dark, rereading the depositions and statements my parents had submitted, trying to find the crack I knew was there. Because people like my parents always overreach. It's their fatal flaw. They become so convinced of their own righteousness that they forget paperwork doesn't love them back. And while they were spinning narratives for the court, I was tracking inconsistencies in their sworn statements line by line, signature by signature. That's when I found it. Buried in a supplemental financial declaration submitted by their attorney was an account number. A trust fund account I didn't recognize, but one they'd claimed had been created for the respondent's benefit, but never accessed due to her alleged incapacity. It was an old account, opened when I was 19. They claimed it held funds they had withheld for my protection, and that the balance had been held in escrow ever since. The lie was subtle, slick, but dangerous. Because I had accessed that account once 7 years ago. I withdrew $500 from it during a tight month in law school, just to cover textbooks. I had the withdrawal receipt, filed in a folder labeled banking history deep in my personal archive. I'd never thought twice about it, but now, that single slip of paper, one yellow document I'd kept out of compulsive caution, was my weapon. Because if they lied about that, if they knowingly claimed under oath that I was never granted access to an account I had physically withdrawn money from, that wasn't just perjury, it was fraud. Olivia's eyes lit up when I showed her the receipt. "We don't hand it over yet," she said. "We wait. We let them double down in court. We give them rope." So we waited. And during those 2 weeks, my parents kept circling. Their lawyer filed more affidavits, all fluff and misdirection, mentions of my erratic independence, of my refusal to respond to holiday invitations, and even screenshots of emails where I told my mother I was not available for family dinner due to high-level obligations. They tried to frame it like I was spiraling, like boundaries were a sign of breakdown. But I knew the difference between independence and instability, and so did the court. By the morning of the hearing, something had shifted. My parents walked into the courtroom with practiced smiles, but there was a tightness in the way my mother kept adjusting her collar, a nervous flick in my father's eyes as he shook hands with their attorney. They expected to win, but the confidence no longer came naturally. They were faking it now. Good, because I wasn't faking anything anymore. The judge entered. The hearing began. Arguments were made predictable, mechanical, desperate. Their attorney repeated the claim about the trust fund. "This account has remained untouched for over a decade, Your Honor. Proof that the respondent was never mentally or financially equipped to make independent decisions." Olivia stood. "Objection. Misstatement of fact." The judge raised a brow. "Counselor?" Olivia stepped forward, calm and methodical. "The respondent has a withdrawal receipt from that very trust account, dated 7 years ago, in the amount of $500. Signed, time-stamped, processed. We have the original copy and digital verification from the issuing bank confirming the transaction. We request this document be entered into the court record." The clerk walked over, took the envelope. My parents didn't react at first. Not visibly, but I saw it. The way my mother's lips parted, the way my father shifted in his seat. The brief, desperate glance they shared like swimmers realizing they'd just kicked off from the edge and found no ground beneath them. The judge looked at the document. Her expression didn't change. Then she looked at my parents. "Did either of you review this account's full transaction history before claiming under oath that it remained untouched?" Their lawyer began to stammer something. The judge raised her hand. "No, I'm not asking your counsel. I'm asking you." Silence. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. The judge nodded, slowly, and for the first time, her voice turned cold. "Knowingly submitting false financial declarations to this court is not only a violation of civil procedure, it is a criminal offense. And in this courtroom, I take that very seriously." She turned to the bailiff. "Please notify the attending officers that I will be requesting an immediate fraud investigation and statement from both petitioners before the end of the day." The room went still. So quiet, I could hear my own breath. So quiet, I could hear the moment my parents' empire built on appearances, manipulation, and decades of quiet intimidation shattered. 2 officers entered. My mother looked around like she didn't understand what was happening. My father tried to speak. "This is absurd. We're her parents." The judge didn't flinch. "You're not above the law." And I didn't move, didn't cry, didn't smile. I simply sat there while the courtroom watched 2 people who had spent their lives controlling mine be escorted out for questioning. And I knew this wasn't over. But the ground had shifted, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one on trial. They were. The investigation began quietly, but I knew better than to mistake quiet for stillness. 3 days after the hearing, I received a phone call from Detective Ramirez, a white-collar crimes investigator with the local PD. Her voice was crisp, efficient, and void of small talk. She confirmed that both of my parents had been temporarily detained for questioning, and that the court's fraud referral had initiated a formal inquiry into their financial conduct over the last 10 years. "We're not charging them yet," she said, "but the paper trail you opened up, it's deep. We're finding more than we expected." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. Because what started with a single fabricated account history was beginning to reveal a far more elaborate pattern one I had always felt growing up but could never name. That strange, persistent tension that hummed beneath the surface of our family dinners, the constant mystery of where the money actually went despite all their bragging about wealth, the way my father had always spoken in vague, hollow terms about diversified investments and legacy holdings whenever anyone asked what he actually did for a living. Now I knew. He wasn't managing wealth, he was hiding it. And my mother? She was the smiling partner in crime, laundering their legacy through parenthood, parading around their role as caregivers while crafting a paper illusion behind closed doors. It had worked for decades, because who questioned the doting couple with a well-spoken daughter and clean front lawn? But now the curtains were pulled back, and what lay behind them wasn't a mistake, it was a machine. Within a week, I was asked to provide full documentation of every financial interaction I'd ever had with them. That meant old checks, gifts, deposits, tuition payments, even birthday transfers. It forced me to revisit my entire life with them not as memories, but as evidence. I combed through folders labeled college, taxes, health, housing. Every line item told a story I hadn't realized I'd been writing for years. Like how the college fund they swore they'd set aside for me had actually been emptied during my sophomore year to pay off a business loan that didn't exist. Or how the house they said they co-signed for was never touched, they hadn't lifted a finger. Or how, for my 28th birthday, they gave me a trust contribution with a ceremonial check for $5,000 but never actually deposited it. The lies were so intricate, so carefully performed, I found myself stunned at the sheer craft of it. They hadn't just been gaslighting me. They had been embezzling parenthood. And I wasn't the only target. Detective Ramirez informed me that the department had launched inquiries into several shell companies connected to my father's name, companies that, according to the state database, had received large financial transfers from other families who had, at some point, filed guardianship petitions over adult children. In other words, this was a pattern. My parents weren't just cruel. They were predators. They had found a way to turn guardianship law into an industry, one where they weaponized the court's sympathy for aging parents against the autonomy of grown, competent adults, almost always women, daughters, nieces, even in one case, a young widow who'd inherited too much too fast. I was no longer in a family dispute. I was in the middle of a conspiracy. The realization didn't sink in all at once. It came in pieces watching Ramirez lay out timelines over lunch, seeing spreadsheets of deposits that led straight to offshore accounts, tracing how my parents had drafted similar petitions. Some failed, some quietly settled in 3 other counties using distant relatives and aliases. The moment I saw the name Melissa B. Hart, a woman I'd never met attached to a guardianship motion filed 10 years ago, I felt something cold settle into my chest. Who is she? I asked. Ramirez shook her head. Your cousin. Died in a psychiatric facility 2 years ago. Never had a diagnosis. She lived in a group home for the last decade of her life. I stared at the screen. She had no lawyer. She had no defense. Just a petition, signed by her concerned relatives. My parents. My blood. The next time I stood in court, I brought everything. Not just the receipt. Not just my testimony. I brought a binder thick enough to crush the lies under its weight. Bank reports. Legal correspondences. Transcripts from previous cases, a statement from Ramirez's department confirming the scope of the investigation, and when the judge asked if I had any final response to the petition for guardianship, I stood, and I handed her one sheet of paper. It was quiet in the courtroom. You could hear a single cough in the far back row. The judge adjusted her glasses. She read the letter once, twice. Then she raised her hand and spoke 4 words I'll never forget. Please call courtroom security. A bailiff appeared instantly, and another. Then the courtroom doors opened and in came 2 uniformed officers from the white-collar division, flanked by a plainclothes detective. Ramirez. My mother's face turned ghost white. My father tried to stand. Mr. and Mrs. Hart, Ramirez said evenly, you're being detained for questioning in connection with an ongoing financial fraud investigation involving multiple fraudulent guardianship petitions, tax evasion, and abuse of fiduciary duty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched as the people who had spent their lives controlling me, my name, my story, my future were finally caught in a moment they couldn't narrate their way out of. And it was only the beginning. They say when a dam breaks, it doesn't happen all at once. It starts with a crack, a single fracture that runs beneath the surface, barely noticeable until one moment, one pressure point, makes the whole structure give way. That's exactly what happened after the courtroom arrest. Once the paper trail was public, once the officers led my parents out of the courthouse in handcuffs, the flood began. Reporters showed up on my doorstep the next morning. At first, I didn't answer. I watched them from behind the blinds, cameras slung over shoulders, microphones in hand, asking questions to an empty doorway. Do you believe your parents had been targeting you for years? Are you the only victim? Is this connected to the Melissa Hart guardianship case from 2012? Their voices blurred together, but the intent was clear. The story had legs, big ones. Olivia called me before noon. Don't go on camera, she said, but don't hide either. Let the story live. Let people see what they did. So I wrote a statement. Just 1 page. No tears. No dramatics. Just facts. A timeline. The truth. I posted it online through a private account with no photo, no tags, just words. By midnight, it had 40,000 shares. Within 48 hours, it was trending nationally under the hashtag #guardianship and the flood turned into a storm. Women began reaching out, young and old, from different states, different backgrounds, different versions of the same silent horror. Some had lost control of their finances. Others had been locked out of family homes. One woman said her sister had filed a petition against her the week after she received a wrongful death settlement. Another described how her grandfather had manipulated guardianship laws to take her inheritance when she turned 21. And then came the messages from attorneys, from paralegals, from clerks who had seen it, had watched it happen for years in sealed hearings, behind closed doors, protected by the polite fiction that parents always know best. This wasn't just about me. This was a system, a machinery of control built on paper and politeness wrapped in the language of care, and protected by the idea that family couldn't possibly mean harm. But they could, and mine had. With Olivia's help, I compiled a dossier of affidavits and personal testimonies from other victims. We organized a legal aid coalition with 2 other law firms, launched a class action initiative against known bad actors, including 2 law offices that had helped my parents file multiple false petitions. Ramirez looped in the state attorney general's office. A legislative aide reached out about working on a bill. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I got an email. It was from the sister of Melissa Hart. Her name was Erin. She had been 15 when Melissa was taken out of their family's custody and placed in a group home. Her voice on the phone trembled not from grief, but from rage that had calcified into something far stronger. They killed her, she said flatly. They wore her down year by year until there was nothing left. And no one ever listened to me. No one believed me when I said something was wrong. I listened, because I knew. We met in person a week later, just 2 women linked by blood and destruction. She brought a manila folder. Inside were Melissa's personal drawings, fragments of journals, letters she'd written but never sent. In one of them, dated 2014, Melissa had written, I keep thinking someone will show up and say, this was all a mistake. You can go home now. But no one ever does. I wept when I read that. Not for the first time. Not for the last. It became my mission to make sure no other woman ever had to write those words. From that moment forward, it wasn't just about court. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about erasure, how quiet it could be, how official it could look, how easily it could disguise itself as love. And I was done letting it go unchecked. The next hearing was different. This time, I wasn't alone at my bench. Behind me sat 4 other women, each of them wrongfully targeted by family guardianship petitions. And behind them, 2 local news anchors, 1 investigative reporter from a national outlet, and half a dozen community members who had read my story and showed up to watch justice happen in real time. My parents, on the other hand, they sat alone. No lawyer this time. He dropped them once the fraud allegations escalated. They looked older, somehow smaller, like people who had been living inside a lie for so long they didn't know how to survive without it. I didn't look at them. I faced the judge. I handed over the class action filing, the letters, the investigative summary from Ramirez's task force, a printed copy of Melissa's note. And I said, "Your Honor, this isn't just a civil dispute. This is a pattern of criminal exploitation hiding behind the structure of family law. And I'm not asking the court for mercy. I'm asking for exposure." The judge took a long pause. She read the letter. Then she closed the folder. "I've been on this bench for 27 years, she said slowly. And I've seen good people break under bad laws. But I've also seen bad people hide behind good ones." She looked directly at my parents. "I'm referring this case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution, and I'm issuing an order to unseal all associated guardianship proceedings filed by the petitioners in the last 15 years. Gasps, then silence. Then the sound of a gavel hitting wood like thunder. I walked out of that courtroom and into the sun, and for the first time since I was a little girl, I felt like I was breathing without asking permission, because the lie was over. And the truth? The truth was just beginning to rise. The first time I stood in front of a microphone, I wasn't wearing a courtroom blazer. I was in a black dress with rolled-up sleeves, no makeup, hair pulled back, standing on the marble steps of the state capitol in front of 3 cameras, 24 supporters, and a banner that read "Protect Autonomy, Stop Guardianship Abuse." The sun beat down on the stone. My voice was clear and unwavering, and every word I spoke carved itself into the silence like a warning to anyone who still thought the system was too obscure to be dangerous. We are not fragile, we are not confused, and we are not property. We are daughters, sisters, veterans, professionals, and we've been silenced by people who were never meant to protect us, but to own us. That ends today. It wasn't just a soundbite. It was a declaration of war. In the weeks after my parents' arrest, I'd done more than testify. I'd organized, reached out to victims, attorneys, whistleblowers. I worked with Ramirez's task force to collect sworn testimonies, exposed a network of lawyers who'd built careers on quiet settlements and backroom filings. I met with lawmakers, showed them Melissa's drawings. One senator cried in his office as I handed him her letter. I told him she could have been me. He responded by co-sponsoring the Lena Hart Act, a bill that would create stricter review processes, mandatory independent counsel for all guardianship respondents, and public registries for repeat petitioners. The law was gaining traction fast, but I wasn't done, because the law couldn't touch everything. Some things had to be seen to be destroyed, so I called a journalist. Not just any journalist, Lena Hart, the Pulitzer-nominated reporter who had exposed financial fraud in hospice care facilities 5 years ago and nearly shut down an entire state agency. She had a voice like a scalpel and eyes that missed nothing. When I met her at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, I gave her everything. Documents, charts, audio recordings. She said nothing for almost an hour as she read. When she finally looked up, she said, "This isn't a profile. This is a series." Her expose dropped in 4 parts across 2 weeks. Part 1. Parental Control. How Guardianship Law Becomes a Weapon. Part 2. The Daughter Who Fought Back and the Judge Who Listened. Part 3. From Trust Funds to Trapdoors. A Financial Exploitation Playbook. Part 4. The Lena Hart Pattern and How It Was Buried for a Decade. Each part was more devastating than the last. With every release, more survivors came forward. Attorneys quit firms that had quietly enabled abuse. Grand juries were formed. One judge resigned under scrutiny for rubber-stamping too many questionable petitions. My parents' faces, once hidden behind the facade of respectable suburban parenthood, were now etched in headlines next to phrases like systematic manipulation and predatory legal abuse. My inbox was flooded, not with pity, but with gratitude. Women who had never spoken out. Women who had lost everything. Women who thought no one would ever believe them. One woman, a school principal from Oregon, wrote, "They told me I was paranoid, but you proved I was right." That letter stayed on my fridge. It reminded me why I kept going, even when the process was brutal, when media scrutiny grew exhausting, when old friends distanced themselves, when I saw pity instead of pride in some people's eyes. I didn't stop. because justice wasn't clean, it was work. And some nights, when the adrenaline wore off, I would sit in my kitchen with a mug of tea, the lights low, and wonder, how did it come to this? How had two people who claimed to love me turned into villains in a story I never asked to write? But the answer was always the same. It hadn't started with hate, it had started with control. And when I outgrew their control, they chose to crush me instead of letting me stand. So I stood anyway. I didn't just reclaim my rights, I reclaimed my name. In court, I filed a legal petition to permanently separate my identity from theirs financially, publicly, historically. I submitted documents to disinherit them from every legal designation they'd forced themselves into: emergency contact, power of attorney, health proxy. Every document had their names crossed out in thick, unmissable ink. I even changed my name, not out of shame, but out of defiance. I took my grandmother's maiden name, the only woman in my family who had never bowed to anyone. A woman they used to call difficult because she ran a dry goods store alone in the 1990s and refused to remarry after her husband died. That woman had lived in the cracks of the stories they told me growing up, dismissed, forgotten. I wasn't going to be forgotten, not anymore. The day the legal name change was granted, I stood outside the clerk's office with the papers in hand, sunlight warming my face, and whispered to the wind, I made it out. And in that moment, it wasn't revenge I felt, it was freedom. But I still had one final move left. Because as much as they had lost reputation, income, legacy, there was one thing they still held on to: the house. The one they always bragged about, the one they said would one day be yours, as if they were giving me a gift when it was bought with tax fraud and manipulative trust games. A house full of family portraits that I wasn't in. A house with no real warmth, only presentation. It had been untouched during the investigation due to procedural delays. But now it was fair game. The house was more than wood, brick, and glass. It was their monument. It stood like a cathedral of narcissism on a quiet tree-lined street where every blade of grass was trimmed to regulation height and the mailboxes gleamed with fresh paint. They had built it not out of need, but out of vanity. 5 bedrooms, even though they were empty nesters. A marble staircase they called architectural flair. A second dining room they never used but always mentioned. The house was never meant to be lived in. It was meant to be shown off. And it was about to be mine. 3 months after the fraud proceedings began, the state froze the Hart family trust pending investigation. One of the final filings I submitted was a civil claim against the estate, backed by the now mountainous evidence of financial theft, guardianship abuse, and fraudulent misrepresentation. I wasn't just seeking damages, I was seeking restitution. The trust held title to one property, a house, and on a crisp October morning, I received an email from the civil court clerk with a single line: "Your motion for asset seizure and reassignment has been granted." I stared at the screen for a long time, because while the public exposure, the arrests, and the legislative momentum had all been victories in their own right, this was different. This wasn't symbolic. This was personal. This was the place where I learned to make myself small, where silence was rewarded and honesty punished. This was the house where I sat alone at the kitchen table doing algebra while my mother sipped wine and whispered to friends that I was difficult. This was the driveway I walked down with my head bowed every Thanksgiving, pretending that pretending was enough. Now it was mine. I didn't waste time. Within 48 hours, I had the keys. A locksmith changed the locks the next morning. I walked through each room without announcing myself, without asking permission. The floors creaked beneath my feet in a way they never had before. Like the house was unsettled. Like it didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't afraid anymore. I found the framed photos still on the mantle. Their wedding portrait. My 3rd grade school picture. My college graduation crop to remove the friend who'd held my hand when I almost didn't walk across the stage. I took them down one by one. I didn't smash them. I didn't throw them out. I boxed them up, labeled the box revisionist history, and left it in the attic. I walked into the master bedroom. My mother's perfume still clung to the curtains. I opened the windows, let the wind tear through the illusion. The bed was perfectly made, pillows arranged just so, probably the same way it had been for decades. I stripped it bare, hauled the mattress out myself, dragged it to the curb, and watched as 2 teenagers from down the street helped me toss it into a rented dumpster. One asked if I was moving in. No, I said. I'm preparing it for someone better. And I meant it, because I wasn't keeping the house. I was repurposing it. With Olivia's help, I contacted the state's newly launched Guardianship Victim Relief Fund, part of the fallout from the legislation we'd pushed through. I offered the property as a transitional shelter for survivors, women forced out of homes by exploitative petitions, women who had nowhere to go after being legally erased. The state agreed to fund the conversion. By January, the renovations had begun. The second dining room was converted into a group counseling space. The upstairs bedrooms became individual suites. The cold, formal living room, once a museum of my parents' pretensions, was transformed into a cozy, sunlit library filled with donated books and warm blankets. We put a plaque at the front door with the center's new name, Melissa's House. We held the dedication in early spring. Press came. The senator who sponsored the bill gave a speech. I stood last, on the same front lawn where I used to rake leaves under threat of grounding, and looked out at a small crowd of survivors, volunteers, and community members. I spoke clearly, into the same kind of microphone I used when I was a child. Back then it was for school plays, where I played trees and townspeople and never the lead. Not anymore. This house was built on a lie, but we've gutted the lie. We've cleared the rot, and now it stands on truth, on survival, on stories that deserve to be told. No one will ever be locked in this place again. They'll only walk through its doors to find freedom. When the ribbon was cut, a woman stepped forward to hug me. She was older than me, soft-spoken, a nurse who had been forced to surrender her license after her sister claimed she was too emotional to work. She whispered, "I thought I was going to die invisible." I looked her in the eye. "You're not invisible anymore." That night, I sat in the back bedroom with the window open, wind stirring the new curtains. The space felt warm, alive, the opposite of what it had been. I knew my parents were still awaiting trial. I knew they were trying to negotiate plea deals, still clinging to whatever scraps of dignity they thought they had left. But I wasn't waiting on their punishment. Their power was already gone. And this house, this center, this victory, it was the kind of revenge they'd never understand. Because they lived to take. And I had learned how to give back better. The war was over, but the silence it left behind wasn't peaceful. It was vast, like the empty space in a gallery after the paintings are removed, a hollow echo where noise used to be familiar, even comforting in its way. I had spent years living beneath the constant drone of manipulation, doubt, and emotional weight, so subtle it took professional unraveling to understand. Now that it was gone, there was space, real space, around me, inside me, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't need to defend every inch of it. I woke up in a small, sun-drenched apartment on the 4th floor of a building that didn't try to impress anyone. No marble lobby, no concierge. Just quiet neighbors, old wood floors, and a landlord who left homemade muffins at everyone's door once a month. It was a far cry from the house I grew up in, and that was precisely the point. I spent my mornings on the balcony with a mug of coffee, not thinking about lawsuits or press statements. I didn't need to plan every word I spoke. No more war room meetings. No more bracing myself for betrayal disguised as concern. The air smelled different, cleaner, sharper. Maybe because I was finally breathing for myself. Professionally, things changed too. After the legislation passed, several law firms reached out with job offers. Some wanted me as a consultant. Others wanted to ride the wave of my notoriety and present a new face to their corporate ethics departments. I declined most of them, because I didn't want to be someone's figurehead. I wanted to build something, so I started small. Foundation, quiet, modest, focused, the Heartline Project. A cruel, but accurate name born from the twisted bloodline that created me and nearly destroyed others. The mission was simple: legal advocacy and emergency housing for adults being targeted by exploitative guardianship actions. No one would have to fight alone the way I did. They'd have lawyers, therapists, financial advisors, a place to stay while the storm passed. Within 6 months, we had over 100 cases in review. We filed emergency injunctions, froze accounts, and walked terrified women through courtrooms where they had expected to be devoured. I personally mentored 5 young women, all in their 20s, who had been blindsided by family members seeking control of their trust funds, inheritances, or even creative royalties. One of them, Sasha, had signed over medical power of attorney to her aunt after a surgery, not realizing it gave her aunt the ability to petition for full guardianship later. Sasha was a screenwriter. Her royalties had gone untouched for months while her aunt claimed she was too foggy to manage contracts. We got it reversed, in front of the same judge who'd handled my case. When Sasha walked out of that courtroom holding the deed to her own intellectual property, she burst into tears. "I didn't think anyone would care," she whispered. "I didn't think I could matter this much." I told her the truth. "You always mattered. They just hoped you'd forget that." We started keeping a whiteboard at the Heartline office. Every time we won a case, secured emergency funds, reversed a petition, or helped a woman keep her autonomy, we marked a red X next to her name coded for privacy. After a while, the board looked like a battlefield dotted with small victories. But to us, it was a constellation. Every X meant a future that stayed whole. Sometimes I still thought about my parents. Not because I missed them, but because I couldn't help but reflect on the depth of their self-deception. They hadn't just tried to take control, they truly believed they deserved it. That entitlement, that corrosive belief that they were owed my life's fruits simply for planting the seed, was the root of their collapse. Their trial was scheduled for the fall. They were each facing a dozen felony counts: fraud, conspiracy, perjury, elder abuse, and unlawful appropriation of assets. Their plea deal had been rejected after the investigation uncovered additional victims. No more sealed records, no more quiet settlements. They would go to court. They would answer, and I wouldn't have to be there to see it. Because by then, I had let them go. Truly, completely, finally. Not in rage, not in victory, but in freedom. The kind of freedom you taste only after walking barefoot through the ashes of a life someone tried to burn down while smiling in your face. The kind of freedom that doesn't just heal, but remakes. And while I knew I'd carry scars, I also knew I'd built something unshakable. Not just for myself, but for everyone who came after. 1 year later, I stood on the stage of a modest auditorium in Boston, not as a daughter, not as a plaintiff or respondent, but as a keynote speaker. The National Legal Advocacy Coalition had invited me to deliver the opening address at their annual conference. The room was full: judges, public defenders, journalists, nonprofit founders, survivors. I looked out over the sea of faces and recognized a dozen stories I had personally helped write into justice. Each of them had once been just like me, cornered, gaslit, erased behind polite courtroom petitions. Now they were unshakable. I used to believe, I said from the podium, that family was sacred, that blood meant safety, that if someone raised you, they must want what's best for you. But I've learned something else. I've learned that trust is earned, not inherited, and survival is not betrayal. Survival is sacred. The applause afterward wasn't loud, it was long, sustained. The kind of clapping that doesn't say bravo, but we see you. After the conference, I walked the city alone for a while. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was simply existing, fully present, breathing air that belonged to no one else but me. My name, my face, my story mine. And as I sat on a park bench overlooking the Charles River, a breeze tugging at the edges of my coat, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who begged for approval in silent glances, who measured her worth in how few waves she made, who thought love meant obedience. That girl was gone. She didn't vanish in court. She didn't disappear in headlines. She evolved into a woman no longer ruled by survival, but by purpose. Melissa's house had just opened its second location, this time in Chicago. We were planning a third in New Mexico. The Heartline Project was expanding into educational workshops for judges and clerks on how to spot fraudulent filings. And legislation bearing Melissa's name had passed in 3 states, with 2 more pending. And in my quiet little apartment, away from cameras and courtrooms, I had created something for myself too. A life, a real one. I had books on the shelf I chose for no other reason than I liked the cover. I cooked dinner for friends who didn't ask me to explain my history like it was a puzzle. I even adopted a dog, an older rescue mutt with a crooked ear and no interest in obeying commands. I named her Justice, not because I was bitter, but because I'd learned justice doesn't always come clean or on time. Sometimes she limps, sometimes she snarls, but she still shows up when it matters, just like I had. The story didn't end with my parents. It didn't end in a courtroom. It didn't even end in victory, because for me, there was no ending, only beginning. The beginning of a life on my terms. The legacy shaped not by inheritance or shame, but by defiance and reclamation. And I would spend the rest of my years making sure the next girl, standing on the brink of erasure, would never have to walk that road alone. Not again. Not ever.